Okay, well, the recording is starting.
Beautiful.
So, Dave, welcome back. It has been several episodes of the podcast since you've been on. If I'm not mistaken, you were on episode 4.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Way back when.
Yeah.
Talking about Azure DevOps on its own at that point and how awesome Azure DevOps is and all that kind of stuff. And now you're back to talk.
I'm back.
About
Finally. Yeah. Some more Azure DevOps stuff. Yeah, finally. It's been quite a while.
Except this time Azure DevOps with a GitHub twist.
Well, yeah. A little GitHub twist. So let's see, eh?
Well, let's get into that a bit because Max and I on the AMAs talk a lot about, GitHub versus Azure DevOps and how all of these different things connect and so on and so forth. And it always kind of sounds like it's a one or the other type of thing. And I know you have a different opinion about that.
Absolutely. Is that what Max has been saying?
No,
it's not.
That's what the questions that we've been getting live.
I see. Yeah. I was going to say, that doesn't sound like Max, because Max is an Azure DevOps lover as much as I am, and a GitHub lover as much as I am. So, Yeah, that's certainly, yes. And I know I've listened to the podcast with Max, and him and I are very much on the same page about these things. Work a lot together. So, yeah. So, as we know, quite a few years ago now, Microsoft purchased GitHub. And as you know, Max and I are both at Microsoft MVPs in the Azure DevOps world, and we were like, "Oh, what does this mean?" Are we better really get learning GitHub now? Not that we hadn't used it before, like every other developer on the planet, right? But yeah, we were kind of, we were going to Microsoft, and the people that we talked to at Microsoft and said, what's happening? And the story at the very beginning was kind of, oh well, over the next few years, it's going to take a while, but we're just going to move over to GitHub and we'll just wind down Azure DevOps. And we were, oh, that's a shame. And when we went to conferences and summits, we would always moan about it and say, this isn't good because we love Azure DevOps, and you better really be building something great over there. Like, you don't have boards, you don't have test plans, you're missing all kinds of stuff. Actions wasn't there yet at that time, or even close at that time. I said, yeah, you got a great repo PR experience. That whole thing is fantastic. And not that Azure repos isn't, it's also fantastic. A couple of little differences between them, but both great products. But over time, since that announcement, it's changed. The message has changed, and Microsoft saw a big upsurge in users signing on to Azure DevOps. And it was like, and I think they were a little surprised. Yeah, it's anecdotal. I'm not speaking on behalf of Microsoft, obviously, right? But I think they were a bit surprised that, they kind of thought, oh, well, everybody used GitHub, and we had this, large set of users on Azure DevOps, and perhaps they'll just all move to GitHub too. But they weren't. People were using Azure DevOps, and more people were using Azure DevOps. And parts of the product that didn't seem to have a lot of play, like Azure Test Plans is my biggest example, were people were climbing on the bandwagon like crazy to use Azure Test Plans, which is also a fantastic product. It has been since 2010 when it was first introduced as God, I can't even remember what it was called back then. But anyway,
that was also an acquisition.
This is what happened. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, from a Toronto company. So anyway, yeah, so things, the landscape has kind of changed a bit. Microsoft is, full force ahead adding features to GitHub, but they're also full force ahead adding features to Azure DevOps. Both of them are, they do things a little bit differently. I would say projects in GitHub are kind of cool, but they're still really very much for an agile or a smaller team, or that kind of thing. And I'm not saying you couldn't make it work for an enterprise, but Azure DevOps definitely works for an enterprise. I mean, you can pick the different template. I've got customers that use it as Agile or Scrum, and I've got customers that are still Waterfall, and they use it that way, and and it works. So, the two of them are living very well together in the ecosystem, and they're both fantastic.
I know a lot of folks typically think of Azure DevOps. You had mentioned it, right? Think of Azure DevOps as sort of the enterprise solution, and then think of GitHub as sort of like the not enterprise, like only for developers and so on. So now this concept of marrying the two together is fascinating, because ultimately you have developers who are in fact working in these enterprise spaces who want to use GitHub because that's what they're used to outside of that. But then an organization has a lot of investment in terms of like pipelines and boards and test plans and so on. And so kind of end up in this conundrum of like, well, how do you satisfy both?
Oh, absolutely. And that was one of the probably initial problems for Microsoft with GitHub, is that it was seen as the open source tool, right? It wasn't an enterprise tool. It wasn't something that the big banks and the insurance companies and the financial partners were going to start using, because they were afraid it wasn't, was it secure? Microsoft introduced in the last couple of years um, a thing called enterprise managed users in GitHub. And when you enable cloud enterprise with enterprise managed users, it gets rid of every user signing in having to have their own personal ID. They just sign in authenticated to your Azure Active Directory. And and that really paved the way for, among a lot of other things, paved the way for enterprises to join in with GitHub. But like you said, that's sort of the other problem, right? So there's a lot of the enterprises were all in Azure DevOps because it was enterprise ready. It was something that they were used to using. So what's the benefit to moving over to GitHub? Like, why would I take all the stuff I got and move it? Like, what's my return on my investment for doing that? Why would I interrupt my devs? Why would I? Well, one of the problems is the devs want to go, right? The devs are the ones that are going, hey, let's move to GitHub. Why can't we use GitHub? Why are we using Azure DevOps? We want to use GitHub. Well, and the dev managers obviously, they've got questions like, well, what are we going to do with our pipelines? And what are we going to do about boards? Are we going to use GitHub projects? Are we going to use actions? Are we going to rewrite all these builds and releases that we've spent so long with the approvals? How long is it going to take us to move all that to GitHub and be the same as it was? And will it be a secure? Have we done our due diligence yet? Do we know for sure? Is actions ready?
Can we even do it? Like,
Yeah,
do we have the
yeah,
skill sets to do it, etc.? For sure.
exactly. So it's great for your devs to go, hey, we want to use GitHub because we use it personally all the time. We use it on projects that we do. We've used it at past jobs, when they work for maybe a smaller company or whatever, and they love it and they want to go there. But it's not as simple as that, right?
It's also not as simple to go the other way, right? Whereas an organization coming in and saying, well, sorry, dev, right? Like, we're an Azure DevOps shop here. And so all this other stuff, all this experience that you have, all your preferences and so on that you have with GitHub, that's not going to work here either, which of course then gets them into a people problem.
Yeah, and that's another great thing that you bring up, is hiring new hires. Like when you hire somebody, like I remember, I've been doing this for a long time. I keep telling you how long.
I love it when you say that. I've been doing this for a long time.
A long time. Listen, it's over 40 years I've been writing code. And but back in the early days of this industry, there were 10 or 12 different source control systems. Well, I shouldn't say it. In the early days of this, there were no source control systems, right? There was no version control of your source. It was just stored on your disk and put on a floppy and shoved in a drawer, and that was security. But as time went on, we've been through an evolution, and Git has just become the industry standard. So everybody that you hire knows Git because they learned it in school, and they know GitHub because they learned it in school. And there's just certain things that they're coming to the table expecting to have and see. And when they show up somewhere and it's all kind of different for them, it might be harder to keep them around.
Yeah.
That
So
might be a stretch, but it's an interesting thought.
I guess nobody's learning Visual Source Safe anymore.
No, or PVCS or
Right? Talk about dating myself.
no
Anywho,
kidding. Anywho, yeah, I was a
anyway,
PVCS instructor, you know,
I
way
didn't
back.
actually, but that's funny,
Yeah.
right? And so
Anyway,
fast forward, then as the evolution of
right.
all of these different things come in, Microsoft sort of, I would imagine, even the Microsoft teams and the GitHub teams kind of get wind of this conundrum, and then if I understood correctly, tell me more about this. But it's kind of like adding in a whole bunch of different things to make, especially for the enterprises, but anyone who's using mixed environments, to make all of this stuff easier. So you mentioned the enterprise managed users before.
Mhm.
Um, what else did they kind of enable to make all of this stuff easy or
So
easier?
so there's a few things. So one, they built GitHub apps for Azure boards and Azure pipelines right out of the gate, like very quickly. So I can actually create an Azure pipeline that builds or deploys an app that's stored in GitHub in version control. Um, and then of course, native to Azure DevOps, you've got service connections. So when you do that, it creates a service connection that points to your GitHub Enterprise with a service account, and you don't have to worry about it. Your devs aren't always trying to, log in. They just create a build. They use the service connection to point to GitHub, and boom, I can pull the source down, build it, deploy it, do whatever. So they did a lot of that stuff, and then they started working on this product called the GitHub Enterprise Importer. And it's a command line tool that has gone through many, many iterations. I think we're up to, I think the first time I ever used it was version 03 or 003. Now we're up to 1.4 or something. So over the last few years, they've been building out this GitHub Enterprise Importer, and it's a great little tool. And what it will do for the team is it'll help us with the start of that transition, or at the very least help us to merge to use the two tools together, even if we're not planning on a full transition over. If we are, then let's take the low-hanging fruit. Let's grab the repos and let's migrate those into GitHub, and let's take our builds and point them to those repos, so our build and release process doesn't get interrupted, and our devs are happy. They're working away in GitHub doing their PRs and everything that they love about GitHub, using Copilot and all that stuff. But at the meantime, we haven't interrupted. We're still using Azure boards, and we're still using Azure pipelines, and all of that stuff is still available to us. And if we are planning on moving completely to GitHub, we've just bought ourselves some time, right? We've started the process. We've made a good chunk of our team happier and maybe more productive in their eyes. And now we can start to look at, okay, well, we've got one app over there. Let's see what happens. Let's try running a project in that GitHub repo instead of doing it in boards, and see how that goes. And we can do some POCs and figure things out. But you get that low-hanging fruit over there really easily and quickly using this tool. So I can show you a little bit of how the tool works if you want to see.
I do actually, but before we switch over to that, just a quick question.
Yeah.
When we think about kind of this way of going about it, where you're kind of enabling these, and let's say you didn't have a tool or you weren't using this particular tool to do it, how else would you do it? It would have to be manual, I would imagine.
Yeah, you'd have to take your code and somehow migrate. I mean, there's an import tool in Azure DevOps for pulling stuff from other places. So I could pull from, other things
Right.
into Azure DevOps. For GitHub, there isn't, I believe there's an import in GitHub. I've been so tied to using this because it's so much easier that I totally forgotten, but I believe there's an import too there. But yeah, you're right. It's a one at a time kind of manual thing, and what a lot of people would do is they just take the tip revision of their code and just start over again in GitHub, and now your history's all over. But I mean, if you've got open PRs at the time, I mean, the nice thing about a tool like this is you can do it mid development. Like I've been doing this for a few customers, and I've had teams that are, they're midstream working, and we pick a date and say, okay, well, they want to do it when they're not in the middle of a release, obviously, and they're so just for their own sanity. But they might have PRs open for the next release that's happening, and they've got discussions going on in their repo. They've got multiple branches, and I literally run a script, and boom, their repo's over there, and their builds are still working.
Okay. Well, I mean, it sounds almost too good to be true. So let's see it. We'll circle back maybe afterwards and kind of see sort of just walk through a little bit more in terms of what that experience would be like for the person, or maybe as you're kind of showing us what the tool is. It'd be really cool to be like, as we're doing this is what users would see, or perhaps would not see. I'm used to like when you're doing an import or a transition, whatever, you kind of say, okay, stop working, everybody stop working, don't do anything for the next 48 hours. And then, you kind of turn it on the next day and you're in the new place. But I suspect that the experience here might be a little bit different.
You hope you're in the new place.
Right. Fair enough. Okay, let's go see it, and then I'll ask the questions as we go.
So yeah, let me start out. Let me just show you where you can grab the tool from. So if you go into GitHub, the tool is GitHub GEI, the GitHub Enterprise Importer. So and we can provide some links after the fact for some of the places that I'm taking you to here. But if you go into the tool, the README is fantastic. It does the typical things that a GitHub README would do. It tells you about the products that are available in here and how to get them installed on your machine and what to do with them. And there's some examples of how to work. And that, of course, points you to the official documentation of how to use it. Wonderful. One thing interesting to point out, there's actually 3 flavors of the tool. So this is a command line tool that is an extension to the GitHub CLI. So you just install it. You install the GitHub CLI, and then you install the extensions. And there are 3 versions, 3 flavors. There's one, GEI is for migrating from GitHub to GitHub. So if you wanted to migrate from a bunch of old orgs that aren't part of an enterprise or aren't under your EMU and you want to migrate those into it, then you can use that. Did a whole bunch of that. Works fantastic. And then there's ADO to GitHub, which is for Azure DevOps. And then there's BBS to GitHub, which is for Bitbucket. So, and Microsoft has done a lot of the changes in the last little while have been for the Bitbucket stuff, because I think it's probably more important for them to help people get off of Bitbucket and onto GitHub than off of Azure DevOps and onto GitHub. But the Azure DevOps one works fantastic. That's the one we'll take a look at today, because that's the one that I've been working a lot with and more familiar. So this is our this is the tool that you want, and once you've got it installed, let me just show you what. I'll flip through some of the commands. I'm not going to bore you with every command there possibly is, because there's so many. Plus, we just don't have time, Jer. So, but I will show you a couple of them. So I kind of organize them into. So first of all, look, if I just say GitHub ADO to GitHub and help. There wasn't a lot of documentation when I started using this. So this is kind of how I figured out how to do stuff. And it'll just show me all the commands that are available to me that I have, right? Just like any other command line tool. Devs or people out there will be very familiar with it. We'll catch on to it very quickly. But just to kind of give you them in groups, there's some prep tools, inventory report. I'll show you that one because it's quite interesting. Generate script. And the generate script command, I may try running one of these for you too. But essentially, it will generate a script for us that does migrations. So it can, and you can pass, you could just pass my Azure DevOps team project, and it'll generate a script that will take all the repos in that project and prepare to migrate them to GitHub. So, right, or everything in an org, if you wanted. You can say, hey, just take everything in my org and move it all over to GitHub. I never did that. I'm not saying that's a great idea, but if you're small enough, maybe it is, right? Sure. Depending on the situation, maybe that. What I used it for was a great little tool to see how Microsoft thinks the script should be built, and kind of walk through how they generated their script to make my own. But then I'll show you one. We'll take one and do a migration. I'll show it to you. And then there's of course migration commands. So there's migrate repo. There's wait for migration, because you can run this async or sync. You can just say migrate like 10 repos, and then have the script wait for each migration. You get a migration ID back from that call, and then you can kind of, as they finish up, you can continue on with the other stuff. You can disable the repo in Azure DevOps. You can lock it. I'll show you what those look like when we do a run a final. But I mean, ideally, what some people would like to do is first lock the repo. So essentially what they do is they make it so that everybody, all the valid users in Azure DevOps have read-only access. So nobody can start mucking around in the repo while I'm in the middle of nothing worse than I've migrated your repo. Oh, well, I just made a change.
Of course.
So that's no good.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier, right? About
Right.
when this runs at the same time, how do we make sure that users are okay with, or it won't lose anything?
Exactly. So, I mean, what you'll see in my final script that we run, and what I tried to do for customers when I did it, my script would have a migrate repo. Well, it would have a lock repo, then it would do the migration, and then it would disable the ADO one. And then I would immediately notify them, your repo is now in GitHub. And even if they went to ADO by mistake, or somebody was away that day and didn't see the email yet, if they went to Azure DevOps, it would be a disabled repo. They couldn't do anything to it anyway.
Right.
And it's read-only. But then, so that's great. I mean, nice to have a way to migrate something quickly and easily. But here's where it really gets good. There's a rewire pipeline. So I can take a pipeline, any builder release that points to one of my Azure DevOps repos to do the build and release, and I can repoint that automatically to GitHub all at the same time. So when I run a script, what it does is it locks the repo, it migrates it to GitHub, it sets it to disabled, then it rewires the pipeline, and then it assigns teams to the repo.
Huh.
So everybody, all in one shot, you've done everything you need to do all in one shot. And there's a whole bunch of it. There's share service connection, and this is a lot to explain. I wrote an article on Medium about it if anybody wants to read it, but it gets kind of tricky because you can set up a service connection in one project and then share it across all of them. And when you're migrating an Azure DevOps customer or user, they might have multiple team projects. So therefore, they might have, what's going to happen when you get to GitHub? Because GitHub doesn't have the concept of team projects. It has orgs, but I don't know that it's always makes sense to make a new org for every team project. So what we tend to do a lot of times in doing a migration is we prefix the name of the repo with the team project name from Azure DevOps, so everybody knows where it came from. But then there's that shared service connection would be across. I would set it up to be across all my team projects, so that the builds that are in multiple team projects are all pointing to the same GitHub org that has repos in it. There's a fair bit of just migrating something it's never as simple as it sounds, right? Because you kind of, as we well know.
What I'm hearing in what you're saying too is just to make sure that a lot of the configuration in terms of org and all that kind of stuff. So like the GitHub side configuration should be done ahead of time, right? You're not doing the configuration as part of the migration.
No. You will have set up your enterprise, your GitHub Enterprise, and you will have made some decisions on how you're going to organize things and how teams are going to be set up and who's going to have access to what and in what way. And then you can build your scripts to move into them, to migrate into it. Yeah.
And I think it's also important to note that, and you've said it, and it's also in the tool's name, but this applies to GitHub Enterprise only.
Yeah, this is a GitHub Enterprise. Yeah. Well, I can use the tool to migrate just into into a GitHub org. I've done that before. Like it works. It does
okay.
Yeah. But it is meant for it. Yeah. The purpose is really to migrate into a GitHub Enterprise.
Cool.
Then we've got a whole bunch of commands for dealing with teams and users. So, you can create a team, you can add a team to a repo, and then you can also manage mannequins. So one of the issues that happens is you migrate something up into GitHub, and the GitHub user. So when you set up GitHub Enterprise manage users, you're going to get an ID that ends with a name. So if you're like underscore company, my company, right? So I might be Dave Lloyd underscore my company, and maybe Jonathan Roosevelt underscore my company, and that's how GitHub maintains that unique ID, because nobody else in the world has that underscore my company. That's what makes it unique. So so you're going to have all these users up there that didn't exist in Azure DevOps, and for if somebody's left, it doesn't matter. The history is there. That's fantastic. But if I want to reassociate that with mine, I can go in and say, oh well, whenever I see, so what it does, it creates what's called a mannequin, right? It's like here's who it was, and I can say, oh well, that's me, and then that'll reset all the PRs and everything to be my ID instead of the mannequin that it created that came out of Azure DevOps. And you can build that into your scripts if you want it. So,
which is all the stuff that you would have otherwise done manually. Or said differently, when I asked you about all of this stuff before, and you're like, well, I guess you could, but if you were going to do it manually, you have to take into account all of the things that you literally just went through.
Yeah. And then there's other commands like configure auto links. So you can set up GitHub to have auto links back into Azure boards. So if I want to refer to a story or a feature or a task, I can have auto links back into so that will set that up automatically for you in your project. And then there's also an integrate boards, which will, so that you can reference stuff about boards. They're all about referencing boards from PRs and commits and stuff like that. So all of these things, these are all different commands that we can run inside there. So let me show you the inventory really quick. This is kind of this is a fun one to kind of get you started. Got to spell it right though, oh, actually, you know what? Let's do it this way. Let's do this. Let's steal instead of me making sure I get it right. So I'm going to run this GitHub. Look what I did. I'll be okay. So I'm running the GitHub ADO to GitHub inventory report on my org. So it's going through and it's reading everything that's in the D Lloyd organization under Azure DevOps. And I can change the scope on this, right? I can do just a team project if I want, or if I had multiple orgs, I can run it on multiple orgs. But what it's doing is it's generating some comma separated value files. We're starting out. And so the first one is the org, and you can see it's just telling me what org I'm doing. And it's saying that in this org, I've got 12 team projects, I've got 23 repos, and I got 18 pipelines, and I got 14 PRs open. So that's just a little inventory of what's going on. But as we dig down into, you'll see the 4 files that it generated. Here's all my team projects. And it's telling me for each team project what the URL is, what the repo count is, what the pipeline count is, and the PR count. And then I can go into repos and I can see all my repos and get information about those. And then I can take a look at all my pipelines and get information about those. So now imagine if I wanted to write a script that took CSV files as input, this can be my input. Right. So now I can say, well, let me see what your inventory, if I was at a really large company and I was the guy that learned the tool and did it for my team, and all of a sudden a VP finds out and goes, oh, hey, how did you guys migrate so quickly? Oh, well, Dave over there built us a script that did this. So, now you can go in and say, well, I can just run my inventory on your project or on your organization that you have, and I'll see exactly what you've got and know what to migrate. And my script will just migrate it by reading from the inventory.
Nice. So a single script, you're just changing the inventory.
Just changing the input to it.
Nice.
And the other command that I was going to show you quickly, but instead of running it, I'll just show you. I've got some outputs from one. But there's a generate script command. So if you ran generate script, you can pass it some arguments and say, well, I want to generate a script I want to generate a script that migrates everything in this team project, or everything in this organization, or just this repo, whatever, right? The scope is totally up to you. And you can tell it you want to make it synchronous or asynchronous. So if you do an asynchronous version, so this is a version of one, and you'll see this is a script that the tool built for me. I didn't write this one. And it builds out some methods to start it off, and it checks to make sure that I've got my GitHub pat and my ADO pat in my environment before I try running, or else it'll kick out. And then it takes every repo and it says GitHub ADO to GitHub, migrate repo. And it will go after the org and the team and the repo. And then it'll do the migration and return me a migration ID. And then it just goes and calls the next one, and it just does them asynchronously. So it calls all of them. And then, later on down the script, it's looking for my, see if we can get past all of these. I have more than I thought. And then it's going to be watching for that migration ID, right? So now it's going, okay, well, when that migration ID is done, I'll know that it's finished, so I can do my next step, which might be to disable the repo, or to rewire the pipeline, or whatever. Mm-hmm. Or you can tell it, you know what, I want to do it synchronously. So it'll do each one synchronously and wait for it to finish. So now I can insert in between each one of these the ability to migrate the pipeline.
Now, all of these are hard coded in there, right? Seemingly from your inventory, but you could technically then just rewrite the part of the script to say, hey, instead of hard coding these, look at my inventory file.
Absolutely. So, or you're so good at sending me on to the next thing. Or if, the inventory is great. I love the inventory. I use the inventory all the time to understand what I was about to migrate, because I don't know every team there. I don't know what they've done. Does everybody name the builds after the repo, or is there a common, consistent naming convention for things? Anyway, so you would hope. And if there is, your life becomes so much easier, because you can just build a script that does it, right? But if you run the inventory scripts, and I actually took what they did, I wrote my own inventory script that gave me even more info than that had, which was, but it was like, I don't know that I would have really thought about it unless I had seen theirs and started out using it. And I thought, oh, I'd also like this, and I'd like to know this. And so then you can build up, it sort of became apparent that to do the migrations, what I wanted to do was just have one script that migrates one repo and everything about it, like rewire the pipeline, disable it, add the team members, right? And then I can build up bigger scripts that call my one script and just pass it through the repos. But at least I know exactly what I'm doing it right. It's modular, right? This is an encapsulated piece. I know what it does. Then I can take my inventory, my CSVs, and build another script that just calls mine, right? But then I've got this one thing. If I want to do it one at a time, I can. Exactly. If I want to do 100 at a time, I can. Right?
So that's how my brain would think, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you have the script that does the thing, and then have an orchestrator that then applies the thing onto a list of repos that you got to do.
Exactly. So let me show you what I've got. Well, let's run it. While it's running, it only takes a minute or two to run, but I'll show you what's in the script, and then we'll go back and see what we ended up with. So if we take a look, I've got an org here called GitHub Migrations. An org called My Shuttle, and it only has one repo in it. There's just that GitHub Migrations one. That's it. There, you see, there's no teams. There's only one repo. So not much going on in there, and that's good. Then over in Azure DevOps, I've got a repo called Employee Services or Shuttle Service in a project called Employee Services. And it has a pipeline called Shuttle Service Build that you can see just for the proof of it, that it's pointing to my Azure repo Git repo. The other thing that I've got in here, just because, and this is sort of, because we talked about it, I want to just show you what is going on. So I have a service connection to my employee services in GitHub. So I created this service connection to GitHub so my Azure DevOps knows about GitHub. And up in GitHub, if we go to GitHub Apps, you'll see I have already installed, there. I've installed an Azure Boards and an Azure Pipelines app. So these two guys, the Azure Pipelines is installing that is what actually created my my service connection in Azure DevOps. But these are the guys that allow GitHub and Azure DevOps to communicate.
Nice.
Okay. So that's all pre-work, right? I mean, it's a one-time thing. You do it once, you're done. It's set up. One thing that if you, like I said, if you have a whole bunch of Azure DevOps team projects, then one thing that you might notice here, if I open up this guy and go to edit, no, oh, wrong spot. One thing that you can see, you set up project permissions. So I got it once, but I might have 10 or 12 projects. So you might want to go through, and right here, you can hit this little plus and you can share it with all your other projects. So if you have pipelines sitting on all those team projects and you're going to migrate repos from them all to GitHub, then you're going to want to share out that thing. But it's a one-time thing, right? You don't do it with every repo. You do it once for the team project and you're done. And that's what this guy does, this share service connection. So you can actually build a script that sets up your teams, shares your service connections, kind of does all the work to, imagine if a team said, hey, Dave, can you come and help us do this? Right. Then I can build a script that does that run once, that kind of sets everything up ready to go. So we've already worked out what GitHub's going to look like. It's organized, it's set up. Now I can set up all the things that I want using that script. And now I'm ready to run my scripts to do all my migrations. So let's run a migration. I don't know why that is doing that, so I'm going to steal it again.
It's always like that.
I know. Okay, so I'm running from my ADO all I'm passing this is my ADO repo, which is Shuttle Service. That's the name of the repo in Azure DevOps, and it's in the Employee Services project. And you can see it's migrating the repo, and it's waiting because it takes a little bit to happen. So while this is doing it, let's take a look at the script that we're running. So I have two mandatory parameters, the repo and the project. If I'm, I could hard code the project. If I'm only doing one project, it's, but quite often I was doing multiple projects. So I made that a parameter in this case. The GitHub repo name, I'm defaulting to be the GitHub or the ADO project -repo, ADO repo name, so that people know the context of where it came from. And it's kind of organized in GitHub, similar to how it was in Azure DevOps. But I can override that by supplying the GitHub repo name. If I don't supply it, it takes my default. And then ADO build, I've got all my builds are called, they're named after the repo with build on the end. So if that's true, I don't have to supply the build name because that's what it'll call it. Or that's what it'll use when it switches it over, it rewires it. But if the build is called something different, then I can put that here as well. Notice in my file system here, all these guys, I'll just point out, these are these are logs. Files. Yeah, so these are log files that are telling me what's going on. So if something fails, I'm going to come to here to find out why it failed. There will
I'm
be an
assuming
error, and I can look it up.
a log file per repo.
Per command. No,
Oh,
per command.
command.
So
Gotcha.
every command I run will get a log file. So then, I just do my check for make sure I got my paths okay. I set up a couple of variables. So I'm hard coding the orgs and the service connection ID. If anybody's curious, the service, I think I'm still on it. The service connection ID is right there. You can just pull it right out of the URL. Just open the service connection and you can just pull it out of the URL in Azure DevOps if you're not sure of any other way to do it. So I just hard coding those for now. They could also obviously be passed in. Here's where I if the GitHub repo wasn't set, then I set it to something myself. Otherwise, I just use what was brought in. So then here's the work. So here's my lock ADO repo. I've commented that out because when I'm demoing, I hate locking it because unlocking it is always more steps that I want to do. But that's that's the call I would make to lock the repo so that nobody can edit it. Then I would do my migration, check the exit code. So it'll just sit here and wait until that's done. And if the exit code comes back equal to 1, then I know something went wrong. And I fail so that I don't try doing other stuff. If it comes back 0, then all is good. And then I can disable the repo. I can rewire the pipeline. And you see, I'm passing essentially the same old things. Everything's just variables in here, right? It's just my ADO org, my ADO project. So everything's a variable. I'm not hard coding anything. Then I'm going to create 2 teams. I'm going to create a developer team and an architect team. And then I'm going to assign those teams access to my new repo. So here's my new GitHub repo. And architects will get maintain permissions and developers will get push or write. GitHub, for whatever reason, in the API calls push, write, and pull, read. Don't ask me why. So, so if we go look in let's go look in Azure DevOps first. So if I go look at that. So if somebody tried to come to shuttle service, this is a disabled repo. I can't, I've disabled it so they can't, they know right away not to do anything. It's been moved. If I set it to read only, then that'll ensure that they don't try harder to do something. And if I go take a look at my release pipeline or my build and edit that, you can see in here the source is now putting the GitHub into my shuttle employee services. Just been switched over. It's using the employee service connection that I set up for GitHub. And if we flip over into GitHub, you can see now, if I just refresh my GitHub org, now I've got an employee services -shuttle service. So I've included the project name on the beginning of the shuttle service. I should have an architects and a developers team. And if I go back into my repo, I've also go into settings here and we can see that collaborators and team members, make me do some logging in. You can see architects have maintain and developers have write. And of course, it was my ID that migrated it. So I get that. Now, the other thing, you're going to see an issue in GitHub with a migration log in it. So if something went wrong, there's going to be a migration log here that tells you exactly what happened with the migration. So everything went fine, so it looks good. But the migration itself, if there was an issue, whether it was permissions or that repo already exists or whatever it happens to be, you'll see it in that log as well. So I've done a great job of helping you. You're obviously going to come across issues and things are going to happen when you first start writing the script and figuring out how to do it. And they've given us lots of ways to help us through that. So pretty easy, eh?
Yeah. The only thing that comes to mind when, as I was watching you do this, so it's all great and dandy. You have, obviously you've done this a million times. You have the scripts, you have the comfort with it. But in the process of creating scripts or to set all this up, what does testing look like, right? Like, because you're not. I would imagine you would want to at least simulate these scripts or something before you go run it on production stuff.
Absolutely. So I would create myself an Azure DevOps team project, or potentially an org. It's so simple to create an org in ADO,
Right.
as long as I'm a collection admin. But yeah, if I've got the power to do this kind of stuff, I probably am a collection admin, or I know them very well, whoever they are. But yeah, I'd set up an org with a team project and a few repos, and I would set up an org in my GitHub Enterprise, in the same enterprise that I'm going to, from the same org that I'm coming from, and yeah, and trial it out, do some migrations, and try some things for sure. And even every time I move to a new team to do some migrations, that I'll often the team is often afraid of what's going to happen.
Of
Right?
course.
Rightly so. I get it. It's like, well, you say you're going to do that in an hour from now, or half an hour from now, or 10 minutes from now. My stuff's all going to be in GitHub, but how do I know I'm going to have permissions, and is it going to be there? Is my PR okay? Am I going to have these branches? So I would quite often, and another reason for having this a script to be able to migrate one repo at a time that I can call from another script, is that I can sit down with the team and I go and say, okay, listen, gang, let's migrate one together. Let's pick one that isn't, it's yours, but maybe it's I don't know. It's not a really high risk one. Maybe it's a library or something, and let's migrate that and together so you guys can see what happened. Um, I've for teams, I've written documentation that explains the steps that it'll take and what will happen and what you'll start with in Azure DevOps. I've created little diagrams for the teams, and you have to do this stuff because and even though it's sometimes as devs and administrators, we think it's so easy to just go and press our little button and off it goes, and yeah, don't worry, it'll be fine. But they need that
Infamous
comfort level.
last words. Don't worry, it'll be fine.
Exactly. So yeah, you got to do those tests, and you got to write that documentation for the team, and you got to walk through it and do it with the team so that they know when you start doing the really important stuff that everything's going to be okay. And a lot of the teams wanted to sit with me and do it, and that's great. That's fine. Take like you saw it, how long it takes. I migrated one repo and rewired its pipeline and added the team to it, and it took about a minute. So even if you had 10 or 20, it's 10 or 20 minutes. It's not hours or over a weekend. It's not that kind of thing. Having that diagram that kind of shows the org structure between Azure DevOps and GitHub and how they map to each other, right? Like where does my team projects go when I get to GitHub, and what will my repos be called, and what were you got to go through that little bit of upfront work so that everybody's okay with how it's going to look. And well, plus you want to do that, right? You want to make sure that you're going in the right direction. And GitHub's a little bit of a different world than Azure DevOps. So
well, and ultimately what you showed here is more of how do you get from one to the other. It's not in lieu of setup, or it's not in lieu of all of these things. It's
right.
like you still have to have thought about all of these things beforehand. I mean, and if you can do that on your own, great. If not, that's what teams call you for. But ultimately, those are you think about all of those different things first. You do all the setup first, then you go migrating this stuff. So of course, it stands to reason that you would want to test out how you want things to look like on the other end.
Yeah.
Before you sit down to do all these scripts, and then sit down and do it, and then do it. Yeah. Dave, one last question for you, because of course there's a slew of questions that can come up, and maybe we'll do an AMA on this afterwards. But just the last thing that came to my mind was, as you're doing this, and let's say what we talked about before, that it'll be one time you're going to do the migration. Is it one of those things where it's like you're going to do it and it does a full? Is there a differential that you do at some point? Like you do it once and then, the team kind of, like, I know you locked it obviously on the other end. do you often see that it's like a one-time do it and then don't worry about it? Have there been instances where it had to have been repeated?
Yeah, I would say 99% of the time it's a do it once and you're done. It's a very, the migration part is something that they built into the tool really early on. It is very solid and stable. Like there's very, even when you get I've gotten new versions and all of a sudden my scripts are broken because they removed a feature. A little example, you used to have to say -wait on the migrate command. And of course, if you don't go read the readmes and you just grab a release, you don't read the release notes, which I would never not do, of course, but and you run your script and all of a sudden you're getting errors about the wait command and you're like, oh, what's going on? They were good about it. They first came this is going to be obsolete soon. And then after a while, it just disappeared. And the default became wait, and you had to do something different just as an example. So yeah, but 99% of the time, it just works. It works fantastic. I've almost never had to do it again. Actually, to be honest, I don't think I've ever done one that I had to do again. But worst case scenario, you've lost nothing. Everything is still in Azure DevOps. You're not deleting the repo down there, right? All you've done is disable it and locked it. The pipeline, it wouldn't hurt. I've got a script that I did too that kind of backs me out of it. So, and that I use for testing, right? Because when I'm testing it, of course, I'm going to migrate my 10, and then of course I want to back out and reset all the pipelines back again and get all that stuff done, and then delete them all in GitHub and do it again.
Of course.
So I have proven that, yeah, if you do it once and something did go wrong, no problem. You just delete what you've got in GitHub, do it again, no problem.
Right. I can imagine the size of relief when you say something like that. It's like, okay, just in case, folks, right? You can just back it out and do it again. It's all good.
It's all good.
It's all good.
Yeah.
Well, put it this way, like I said, it seems straightforward. I would imagine it's kind of like, as you said, go in there, try it out, play with it. I would imagine that there are some questions, in which case, I know you had mentioned your Medium article. I know it goes into a lot more detail than that. And, for any other questions that come up, then anyone watching this will know how to reach us or reach you. That is, I can't help you with the tool. Only Dave can. But let's see where it goes. Let's see what questions come up, and maybe we'll have you back and we'll do an AMA.
Sure, that'd be great. Yeah, if anybody's interested in there's actually, I think, 5 articles on Medium. I split it up into, prep, migrate, pipelines, teams. So yeah, it kind of walks you through a whole thing. And don't underestimate the amount of time it's going to take you to do the planning and build this set of scripts. It's not there is, you can build one fast and just go, but it isn't going to work for everything. You're either going to rebuild it for every repo, which you don't want to do, or you're going to take the time and build it properly so that you can just go and easily migrate safely.
Words of
Thanks, Jair, for having me. It was fun.
Words of wisdom from experience of obviously doing this, just once or twice.
Once or twice, yeah. Once or twice.
Anyways, thank you so much, Dave. Always a pleasure. And
always a pleasure.
I'm looking forward to hearing how folks use this and what questions come up. So thanks so much.
Talk to you later.